So now that we have step one, we kind of reviewed the data set that we're working with. Step two was we created our temp table of names, of replacement names, and we also added this try-catch block up here at the beginning, so in case we run this query again, it'll go ahead and drop that temp table so it can be rebuilt. We did a select star from names from the temp table of names and just verify that we're getting those results in there. So now at step three, we're going to start by building out our cursor. And our cursor, the goal of our cursor is to loop through all the records in our owners table. And for each owner in the table, we're going to randomly select a first and last name. We're actually wanting to pick separate rows from the temp table of names. And then we'll update the first and last name with the randomly selected names. So just to kind of look at the result set here for a moment, my goal is to be able to pick like the first name row, or out of the first row pick the first name, and then out of the 13th row pick the last name, and make those be a pair. So that way the data is more unique and there's less consistency. In order to do that effectively, that's going to require us to randomly generate at least two numbers and then select the first and last name from those rows respectively. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and set up the cursor so that we can walk through a row at a time in the owners table and actually get through the approach or the process of doing the update. So a cursor is a routine that allows you to process one record at a time. So typically when you think of insert, update, deletes, and select statements, you're kind of dealing with whatever results you can kind of filter or query down to with your conditional statements, with your where clause. What we're doing here is we're actually able to walk one record at a time over a particular result set and make decisions capturing values within that particular row and do particular work, which is what works well for this case here. Because we're wanting to randomly generate two numbers based on each row, we want to do that one row at a time. Otherwise, we'll have to randomly generate two numbers, then we'll have to update all the rows based off those two numbers, and then everybody ends up with the same first and last name. It's not really unique. So to set up a cursor, we use a declaration just like if we're declaring a variable. So we'll say declare, and we'll call it the owner cursor. And this is just whatever name you want to give it. I could call this applesauce cheesecake. I could call it whatever I wanted, but I'm giving it a name that actually means something in the context of what I'm doing. And this will be our cursor. And then this is for the purpose of pulling back what data. So for, we're going to select the ID from the owner table. And with our data, the ID is the primary key, and the owner table obviously is the table of owners. Just to kind of give us a point of reference as we're working through this, I'm going to reselect owner so you can see what we're kind of working with here. So every time I hit a row, I want to perform that update. So that's the set that I'm going to be walking through. Is pretty much I'm going to be pulling the ID from each owner in the owners table, and that's what I'm going to be making my changes on. So now the next step here is to open the owner cursor, and that opens it so that basically executes the select statement and makes it so that we're ready to go and fetch data. So the fetch is literally called fetch, F-E-T-C-H. And we're going to fetch next from owner cursor. And we're going to insert into, and this is where we need to actually set up a variable in order to capture. We want to capture that ID into a variable. I'm going to call the variable owner ID. Now, in order for owner ID to work and to actually quote unquote be a thing, we first need to declare it. So I'm going to declare owner ID as an integer. So this is the declaration of that variable, and this is me fetching one of the rows and taking that ID from the select statement up here, and I'm inserting it into this owner ID. So this is the ID from owner. So now that we've selected that owner, we need to enable ourselves to loop through each one of these rows and process it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a while loop, and then we're going to use a system variable called fetch status, and we're going to make sure that that fetch status equals 0. And by checking to make sure that fetch status equals 0 means that when this fetch next statement was executed, if we received a value back, the fetch status is 0. If it's something other than 0, that means that an error occurred or we've reached the end, and therefore we don't want to process any more data. So we'll have a beginning and an end block. So this while consists of a beginning and end. And then inside of it, this is where we're going to do the work. So we're going to do work of generating 2 random numbers. We're going to do the work of capturing first and last name based on random numbers. And then we're going to be updating first and last name of the owner record based on the owner ID. So that'll be the work that we'll need to do inside of here. And then for now, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to print the owner ID just so that we have a body to our cursor and we have kind of a point of reference so we can see what's happening. So then once we're done doing our while, then we're going to close the owner cursor, and then you have to deallocate. And that's basically to release any resources. If I can type and talk at the same time, we're releasing any resources that were used by that cursor. Alright, so that is the process of utilizing a cursor. So if we go ahead and run this now, what will happen is that it's going to go through all of the owners, all the owner, grab all the IDs for the owner one at a time, and then we're going to print out that owner ID. So we're going to end up with a printed list of every owner ID, which is basically this primary key column. You'll see that there's thousands of records. There's 3,300 plus records in here, so we're just going to end up with a list of 1 to 3344 or 3345. So if we go ahead and run this, and it's currently processing, it's having to loop through each one at a time and print out that ID. So it will take a little longer. It's actually a good thing to note that cursors are significantly slower performance-wise than running things like update statements and insert statements, because you're actually working against one record at a time. So even though you're doing something as simplistic as maybe printing the ID of each owner, the performance hit of a cursor versus doing it via some sort of other routine is fairly significant. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Cursors are really good for needing to generate unique values or do unique work based on each record and having a lot of like conditional work. But I would not recommend using them frequently. And I always like to joke and say that the people who develop SQL and develop the concept of a cursor, I think they kind of do that a little tongue-in-cheek, because there's a lot of work that goes into the syntax of setting up and utilizing a cursor compared to something like an update statement. If we were just doing this in a straight update statement, ideally it would probably be about 5 to 10 lines. Right now we're all the way up to granted, there's some comments and stuff in here, but we're hitting a pretty significant number of lines just for generating this cursor and doing this work. So I said that the cursors are very inefficient and it takes a while, which is true. Yeah, I had to cut, stop, and retype most of this. So as I was writing this, I realized, or running it, I should say, I realized that I forgot to actually tell it to fetch the next record. So if you've ever written a while loop where you neglected to actually iterate, basically it was just looping over the first record over and over and over and over and over and over indefinitely, instead of going on to the next owner in the owner's table. So fetching the next record is really important when you're actually going to test out a cursor. Otherwise, you just end up with an infinite loop. So one lesson learned, second lesson learned, it's always good to save your code at least at some point during the code writing process. So in case you totally botch it, you've got a backup. All right. So yeah, I had to rewrite all this. That was fun. All right. So fetching fetching the next record is fetch next. Clever, right? From owner cursor. And then we're going to go into the same owner ID. So it's really this exact same block here of fetch. We just have to call it again. So that will then grab the next record, which will then loop back and check the fetch status of this command. And as long as the fetch status is still good, then we'll go through again. So let's save that, hit execute, and hopefully it won't take an hour to run. All right, so that's now processed. If we go into messages, we'll see there's each one of those primary keys getting dumped out one at a time in that print. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so that is it for this particular module. In the next module, we'll work through the logistics of how we generate those random numbers, capture those records, and then actually get things ready to do that update.